Hopefully you enjoyed those development videos. Next up, I'd like to show you behind the scenes what it takes to configure Polly such that we can provide that developer experience that we showed. One of the most important parts of configuring Polly is to actually train it on API endpoints that you want to make available to your developers. Now, the beauty of the training is that only one person has to learn how to use the API, and others can benefit from using it as a function. Some of these APIs might come pre-trained, either having been trained by Polly or by vendors or by our partners. But other APIs you might have to train yourself, and so this video is going to show you how. To train Polly, basically what you do is you download our Postman scripts. There's two scripts, a post request script and a pre-request script. And these two scripts are what collects the information about the request and the response and passes it over to the Polly server, where we use this information to actually build the object model that we showed you in previous videos. I like to go ahead and have a collection that has these scripts enabled, and I name it training. Into this collection, I like to drag the APIs that I'd like to train. So this is a request that basically allows us to get a token. Now keep in mind, we're just using Postman mock services here because I wanted to keep the APIs as simple as possible to illustrate the concepts in the most minimalistic form possible. So we're going to go ahead and take this get token call and drag it into training. And then I'm going to go ahead and open up the console, and I'm going to go ahead and hit send. Now we only train off of successful API calls. So you can see that we got a 200. We have our little access token and it expires in. We can see that Polly's gone ahead and begun building the model. The thing that takes the most time is actually having AI generate all the descriptions for the arguments and the function. So we can see that this function has now been successfully trained. So let's go ahead and do the same thing for order creation as well as getting a quote from a carrier. So next up, let me do the get quote from carrier. We'll paste this in here. This is a get call. Now I have some query parameters here. And keep in mind, I get the flexibility of naming my environment variables in Postman what I want the arguments to be called in Polly. And they don't have to be named the same thing that they are called in the underlying API. So you do have the ability to kind of shape the interface a bit. However, this is highly subjective, so please choose whatever is most appropriate for your developer audience. So we'll go ahead and hit send here. And we can see that this one's been successful as well. And lastly, let's do create orders. So here, I like to first start on some of these more complicated API calls with a full request showing the full payload just to make sure I can get that working. Then I like to go ahead and annotate the payload with some additional commentary, including whether this element is optional or required. And this allows me to basically communicate with the developers that are going to be consuming these API calls. Now, we all know that puts and posts and patches are usually the more complicated ones, so it doesn't hurt to go ahead and actually provide additional commentary, if you can, to the developers that are going to be consuming these APIs. So I wrote up some comments, I marked a few things optional, and then I go ahead and copy and paste some of those sub-objects into Postman arguments or environment variables, and that's what's going to allow these to become Polly function arguments. So here I have one object representing the customer, and I have another object representing the array of line items. Now, you can make the whole payload a single object. You can enumerate every single payload element as its own environment variable. You have a lot of flexibility here. I found that the middle ground is the most helpful, where you still treat objects as objects. However, many of these more complicated payloads are really just composite payloads where they're multiples of objects assembled into a more complicated payload. And in those cases, I like to still keep them as separate objects to help the developers using these APIs. So let's go ahead and hit send. Let's go ahead and move it to training. And let's go ahead and hit send. All right, so now we have our 3 functions trained. Now let's go ahead and see what Polly has learned about these functions. I'll go ahead and hit send, and I'll go ahead and close the console. And so here we're looking within Polly's system inside our function/API So these are the three functions that have been built. And you can see that the AI has taken a stab at naming these. Now, they are from Postman, so it's gone ahead and put them all in the context of Postman. So I'll go ahead and fix that just to make our scenario look more realistic. And to do so, I can go ahead and actually go inside a specific function. And here we can see the full details of it, including the arguments, the respective descriptions. We can see the schemas that were generated. So you could see that we have object definitions for both the customer and for the order line items. And we're using JSON type schema to represent this. You can think of this as kind of the core data that Poly has. Additionally, we build a source object, which shows you how these arguments assemble into the API call. And lastly, we build a return type schema that basically shows you what you're going to get back as a model. So this modeling is really what makes Poly so powerful, is because you go from observing an API call to having this model, and then we use this model to power the AI discovery experience that I showed you, as well as the library generation. So lastly, I'll go ahead and just rename the name and the context. You can, by the way, patch any of this data. Over time, we're going to make it easier by creating a UI that allows you to edit it more seamlessly. But for now, we just have the patch call, so feel free to use that to modify these as you see fit. All right, great. So let me go ahead and do a patch. Well, actually, let's rename the context to, let's just do logistics. And let's do create order. Great, so you can see that now the function name is create order and it's in the context of logistics.orders. So I'm gonna go ahead and wrap up this video here. After this video, I'm gonna go rename the other two functions to make them a little more standardized, and then I'll see you in the next video.